back in Washington. My wife Mary, who's actually here, someplace here this morning, she's over here. We live in Mount Vernon, Virginia, on property that George Washington used to own. And if you probably heard the old story about Washington throwing $1 across the Potomac, you know, dollar went a lot further back then than it does now. Plus, the dollar actually was real metal. It actually was worth something. You know, it was either gold or silver back then. Now we have a fiat currency, and that's a whole different story, if you will. But what I'd like to do is to talk to you about some truth and transparency. And some of this you'll like, and some of it you may not like, but I think it will be true to those two words, truth and transparency. Because as the Comptroller General of the United States, that's the business I was in. Speaking truth to power, even when power didn't necessarily want to hear the truth. And in some circumstances, even if they were willing to hear it, they didn't want to do anything about it. And let me say at the outset that I am a political independent. Early in life, I used to be something called a conservative Democrat. And that is now an endangered species. And then I became a moderate Republican. That is now an endangered species. And I have been a political independent since 1997. And I'm pleased to say that a plurality of Americans are now political independents. And a growing plurality of Americans. Which it's good news because everybody will work with you. It's bad news because you're not on anybody else's team. And so one of the things that I think that we need to keep in mind is that we need to move beyond bipartisanship to nonpartisanship. Because if we don't approach things on that basis, by definition, we're leaving out a plurality of Americans and an increasing plurality of Americans. And whether you belong to the Libertarian Party or whatever party it might be, an increasing percentage of this country is not aligned with one of the two major political parties. And I think that's likely to that percentage is likely to increase rather than decrease over time. Now, I noted when I was looking at the mission and the charter of the National Taxpayers Union that it had the words lower taxes and smaller government. Now, let me tell you where I'm coming from on this. I believe in low taxes and limited government. But I'm also a realist. And I don't believe you're going to see lower taxes and smaller government. And in fact, my fear is if we don't start making some tough choices soon, you're going to see much higher taxes and an expanded role for government in ways that I know would make me uncomfortable, and I'm confident would make you uncomfortable as well. And so I think everything in the world is relative. To me, when you look at a particular objective or performance, you have to say, how are you doing based upon standards? Are you getting better or worse? And how do you compare to your peer group? In the case of a country, it's a comparator group, like industrialized nations, if you will. And so I think it's in that context, and knowing what I know about where we are and where we're headed from a financial standpoint, that I think it's very realistic to be very staunchly for low taxes and limited government. And I think we have a real problem in that regard. But I think it's unrealistic, in my view, to expect that we're going to get lower taxes and smaller government when you hear some numbers that I'm going to give you. Let me start off with a few numbers. I'm a certified public accountant. I know how to add. That's a real asset in this town. And it's also somewhat of a rarity in this town, I might add as well. Let me talk about 4 Ds. Deficits, debt, dependency, and the ditch. Deficits. In the last 4 years, the United States federal government has had unified budget deficits of $162 billion in 2007, $459 billion in 2008, and now an estimated $1.8 trillion plus for 2009, or 1,800 billion plus. Now, let's try to have some metrics for 1.8 trillion. 1.8 trillion is 3.4 million a minute, 200 million an hour, 5 billion a day. So let's have a metric on that. Remember about a month ago when the president called in to the White House, the cabinet, and said, you know, people are concerned about fiscal responsibility, so we're going to save $100 million. Now, I want you to know, as you can probably figure out, $100 million is 30 minutes worth of deficit. I also want you to know is they're still working on trying to figure out how to save $100 million, and it's probably going to take them a few more months before they got a plan that's actionable. Secondly, within the last month, there was a proposal from the administration to eliminate $17 billion worth of federal programs. Laudable, clearly a number that will get your attention more than $100 million. In the interest of full and fair disclosure, President George W. Bush proposed to eliminate $34 billion worth of programs, and he wasn't successful to a great extent. He had very limited success. So just because you end up proposing to eliminate significant programs doesn't mean it's going to happen. But let's benchmark 17 billion. 17 billion is 3.4 days worth of deficit. So the simple fact of the matter is that we're dealing with numbers that are mind-boggling today. Now let's talk about debt. In the last 8.5 years, the debt of the United States, total debt, has doubled. Basically, in the last 8.5 years, we've accumulated as much debt as we did from 1789 to 2000. Dependency. Since 1990, our dependency on foreign lenders has grown from 20% of debt held by the public to over 50% of debt held by the public and growing. That is up from 0% at the end of World War II. At the end of World War II, we had debt to GDP of 122%, but we owed it all to Americans. We invested in our own future. We won the war. We saved the free world. But since the late 1970s, we've become increasingly dependent on foreign lenders because Americans don't save very well. And the result of that is not in our long-term economic, foreign policy, national security, or even domestic tranquility interest. And then fourthly, the ditch. As of September 30, 2008, the federal government had total liabilities and unfunded promises for Medicare and Social Security alone of $56.4 trillion, up from $20.4 trillion in 2000. Medicare representing the bulk of that. And Medicare prescription drugs, the bill that was supposed to save us money, according to some, represented $8 trillion of that amount. That number is growing by around $3 trillion a year, even with a balanced budget. Needless to say, we're a long way away from a balanced budget. So therefore, by the end of this fiscal year, which is September 30, I expect that the ditch, or the total federal financial hole, will be deeper to the tune of about $62+ trillion. Now, I haven't done the math on the $62 trillion yet, but I have done the math on the $56.4 trillion. That's $483,000 per household. Median household income in America is $50,000 a year. So that means that the typical American household has a second or third mortgage equal to 9 to 10 times median household income. But unlike a typical mortgage, no house to back this mortgage. And it's going up every second of every minute of every day on autopilot. You know, we have a fiscal policy problem, which means tax and spending imbalance, which is determined by the Congress and the President. First the Congress, then the President. We also have a monetary policy problem. The Federal Reserve is printing money rapidly. In the last year, the balance sheet of the Federal Reserve has doubled. How do you do that? You print money. But what we don't know yet, and we won't know until the end of this calendar year, is what is the total value of the trillions of dollars of commitments and contingencies that the Federal Reserve, the FDIC, and other agencies have entered into since October 1 of last year. Because things really started to go south in this fiscal year, which started October 1, 2008. And that's when government started taking a number of actions, many of which did not go through the budget, such as guaranteeing certain bank debt, such as guaranteeing Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac debt, such as various other actions. And by the way, why did we guarantee Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac debt? Because it was not backed by the full faith and credit of the United States government? The answer is in large part because Japan and China demanded it. Japan and China demanded it. And why did Tim Geithner spend 2 days in China within the last week? Because the Chinese are now speaking publicly about their concerns about whether or not the U.S. government is going to be able to get its financial house in order and what the long-term value of the dollar might be. And quite frankly, they have a lot of dollar reserves and they have a lot of our debt. They're now number one to Japan. Japan is now number 2 with regard to holding our debt. And by the way, China is now shortening their duration of our debt. They're moving from longer-term debt to shorter-term debt, and they're also in a position of now starting to try to get rid of some of their dollar holdings by buying commodities and other mineral and other rights in other parts of the world in order to hedge against a potential decline of the dollar over time. So we have a fiscal policy problem. We have a monetary policy problem. Now that's at the federal level. We got problems at the state and local level too. State and local governments face large and growing structural deficits in the years ahead. In fact, this year, 42 of 50 states had major fiscal challenges that required significant changes throughout the year in their budget and their policies. What are the drivers of their fiscal challenge? Number one, Medicaid, which is a shared federal-state responsibility. Number two, infrastructure needs. Number three, education. Number four, unfunded retiree health benefits. And number five, underfunded pension plans. For all those reasons and more, state and local governments face their own challenges. So if the federal government has a problem, we need to keep in mind the old rule, bad news flows downhill. And if state and local governments have their own problems, that means that we nationally have a much bigger problem than just the federal government. How many of you from California? Basket case. Basket case. California has got an even bigger problem because spending is out of control, and frankly, it's got the limitations on taxes as well. And plus, you have referendum government out there. I mean, there's a limit as to how much you can have everybody vote on and actually be able to make, tough decisions, if you will. And one of the concerns that I have is that with a lot of the money that the federal government is passing out to the states this year, as part of the quote-unquote stimulus bill, and I'll come back to that, what are the state and localities going to do with that? Are they going to use that prudently in order to try to help do things that will help create a better future and improve our economic outlook and development going forward? Or are they just going to use that money to prop up the status quo and delay making tough choices. I'm hoping they do the former rather than the latter, because believe me, just as the federal government has grown into a bloated bureaucracy, just as it has overpromised and underdelivered, many states have too. And they're all going to have to rationalize what they're doing and how they do it and who does business going forward, because the numbers just don't come close to adding up. Now, to me, we have a short-term problem and a structural problem on the fiscal side. Let me clarify what I mean by that. In the short term, we've got huge deficits, and we're accumulating debt at record rates for peacetime. That's a concern. And quite frankly, we've wasted a lot of money with some of the actions by the federal government in recent times. I'll come back to that. But I'm less concerned about the short-term problem as I am the structural problem. The structural problem is the huge unfunded obligations, off-balance sheet obligations that are growing, the large and growing mismatch between projected revenues and projected expenditures under a status quo, do nothing, let it ride path. That's what I'm more concerned about. We can deal with the deficit debt levels that are going up in the short term. What threatens our collective future is that structural imbalance, and I'll come back to that. But let me talk to you about a few short-term actions and tell you the concerns that I've had with regard to them. By the way, I'm going to save plenty of time for questions. Number one, TARP, Troubled Asset Relief Program. My question to you, if anybody's got an answer, shout it out. What did we get for $350 billion?
Toxic assets.
Toxic assets? Well, actually, they didn't buy toxic assets, but that's what they were going to do, okay? Here's the deal. The answer is, we don't know. We don't know what we got. Now, you might ask, why do we not know? Because we didn't follow, and when I say we, it's not me. Let me be very clear, okay? And I'm sure it's none of you, okay? Let me be very clear. They were dealing with our money, but we didn't make the decision. When I say we, what I'm talking about is the government didn't do three things that are Management 101. First, have clearly defined objectives about what you're trying to achieve. Number two, have criteria that are identified in advance, that are transparent about who would get the money and who wouldn't get the money based on the objectives you're trying to achieve. And then number three, have conditions established up front so that people knew that if they took the money, what they could and what they couldn't do with the money. Well, we were 0 for 3. That's called a strikeout. All right? And so after $350 billion, we don't really know what we got. Now, people tell us, well, it would have been worse had we not done it. You can't prove a negative. Second issue, the stimulus program. Also the Reinvestment Act, which, and it's a good thing they renamed it, because of the $787 billion, only about a third of it, according to the Congressional Budget Office, meets the definition of stimulus. Timely, targeted, and temporary. And so far, only about 14% of it has been spent. So the fact of the matter is that, only about a third of it was true stimulus. What was the other 2/3? It was a variety of things that had varying degrees of merit. They represented, quote unquote, investments. I learned a long time ago that one person's investment is another person's waste. But no matter what you think about the particular merit of the investments, some of which I think were meritorious, none of which were paid for. They were passed under emergency legislation, so therefore we discharged the national credit card. And since we don't have a credit limit, then we just don't worry about it. Another example, the fiscal 2009 Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act. The base budget, not spending money to get the economy going, to deal with financial institutions and housing and other non-business cycle challenges, but the regular base budget. Now, most organizations that I know today, including state and local governments and private sector entities, they're cutting back on their budget. Because these are tough times. On the base budget, the federal, not the federal, savings rates are up. We had negative personal savings rates in this country for 2 years in a row recently. but they're now up. And the reason they're up is because Americans now know what a rainy day is, and they are not spending as much, they're not taking on as much debt, and they're saving more. The latest number I heard was 6.2%. It was 4.2% for the first quarter. Now that's still not high enough, okay, but it's up. Secondly, we are doing things that we would not be able to do absent a Federal Reserve system and absent a central bank intervening with regard to monetary policy. There's no question about that. And then the question is, how long are we going to be able to get away with that before there could potentially be a crash in the dollar or some other significant adverse implication that would hurt the country and hurt citizens? All right. My point is that we ought to wake up and recognize reality. Whether it's fiscal policy or monetary policy, neither one of them are sustainable. And so while you can justify certain actions that have taken place in the short term because of the global recession, but more because of the non-business cycle challenge associated with financial institutions, housing, etc., you can't end up supporting where we're headed because we had a problem before we experienced these short-term challenges. The problem's bigger and it's closer to hitting us. And so I realize that doesn't cover everything you wanted me to cover, but it gives you some.
A couple of questions. First, you mentioned a couple of bills. I wonder, are there any other bills in Congress that have intellectual merit that we should take a look at to help solve this issue? And then second, you have a huge potential budget. I'm curious as to what the strategy is of the Family Foundation and what we can do to help support that strategy.
Well, first, I'm sure there are other bills that have intellectual merit, but there are so many bills in Congress right now, and time doesn't allow me to be able to go further. I was really just focusing on federal fiscal responsibility, which is what we're focusing on. Our mission is federal fiscal responsibility, or federal financial responsibility overwhelmingly, and secondarily, personal financial responsibility and the intersection between those two, because they are interrelated, if you will, but that's really where we're coming from. Now, what we're trying to do is educate, activate, to accelerate action. We have a multi-pronged strategy. There are 4 groups that we want to have a disproportionate amount of emphasis on. Young people, because they're going to pay the price and bear the burden if they fail to act, or if others fail to act, okay, and if they fail to act too, frankly. Secondly, business and professional leaders. Thirdly, traditional and new media. And fourthly, elected officials and key influential groups, okay, not-for-profit groups that have influence on elected officials. We are 501c3. We don't lobby, but lobbying is very narrowly defined. 99% of what we need to do, we can do through our 501c3 status because we talk about facts and we talk about options and we talk about intellectual merit. We don't endorse or oppose specific pieces of legislation. We don't stimulate a call to action where we say, all right, click on this button and this will go directly to your congressman. What can you do? You can do several things. One, you can go to our website, which is pgpf.org, and on that website there is a citizen action section. If you put your name in there, we will protect your privacy and we won't ask you for money. Right now we have about 190,000 people that have done that. And we are now in the process of trying to understand where those people are, because there are 2 big things we want to do this next year. We want to be able to start working on some sensible solutions, not the answer, but things that need to be discussed. And secondly, we want to stimulate efforts in major cities around the country in partnership with other organizations. We're nonpartisan, staunchly nonpartisan, but frankly, saving the country is not a partisan thing. By the way, let me just mention that before I go to the next question. Our objective is to save the republic. Not to save the mankind, not to save the world, that's a little overreaching. Save the republic. The U.S. is going to be here, but the Republic is at risk. There is a plan B. Vancouver, British Columbia, because New Zealand is too far. One more question. Who hasn't asked one yet? Back, all right.
All right, thank you. 3 quick things: the tax code,
Yep.
Fiscal ratings, and what do you call it, election reform idea. The GAO did a report on the tax code in 2005, August, summary of estimates of the cost of the federal tax system. They looked at not only the compliance costs, but also something called efficiency costs. Today, the compliance costs are $300 billion a year. A lot of people don't know that the efficiency costs, which is a separate category, they cited a study by Martin Feldstein, which put the estimate at up to 5% of GDP max, which would be $700 billion today. Right. Is that accurate? Number 2, I know also Robert Carroll from Tax Foundation said in front of the Senate Finance Committee that dramatic tax reform could increase GDP 1.3 trillion. So I assume he's using that reference. Number 2, NTU has the best fiscal ratings, the most comprehensive ratings. Number 1, I think they're underutilized. And B, it doesn't cover new candidates. It just covers existing office holders. I think voters who are clueless because of the media need like a fiscal responsibility rating on new candidates, and also at the primary level. Third thing, using ATR, Americans for Tax Reform's No New Taxes pledge. What about expanding that? Obviously, the best thing would be a no new net spending pledge, but even going beyond that, what about like if an issue polls at, let's say, like 66% of the population in the objective polling, the candidate would pledge to vote that way? In other words, you can't get a constitutional amendment in this environment, but if we went through that way, maybe that would work.
Well, first, I'm familiar with the GAO report you talked about. I was Comptroller General of the United States when it was issued. I don't recall all the details, but I can tell you this: if it was included in the GAO report, you can have confidence in it. In the 10 years that I was there, we never had to withdraw a report and reissue a report. The procedures that we have for referencing and quality assurance are very, very rigorous. It's not perfect by any means, but it's a reliable source. Secondly, with regard to the ratings, obviously I think it has intellectual merit. The question is, at what point do you give somebody a rating, and how are you going to go about doing that? Who's going to do it? How much is it going to cost? I mean, obviously, to the extent you talk about the general election, I agree with you. It's better to go beyond just current office holders. I think we ought to go for people who are running for office. And then the question is, where do you cut it off? Because there's a lot of people that run for office, and what's the practicality of being able to get that done? And then thirdly, Americans for Tax Reform. What was it? Remember last year?
Could the pledge, their pledge be broad, cover all?
Well, first, I'm not a big pledge guy, other than Pledge Allegiance, okay? Seriously. I mean, and other than oaths to the Constitution and stuff like that. But I actually think it's actually a problem, personally, to get people to sign a pledge that says, I will never do this or never do that, when the evidence is clear and compelling that we're going to have to reform entitlement programs, we're going to have to constrain spending, we need statutory budget controls, and taxes are going up. They're going up. All right? I think you'd be a lot better off making somebody sign a pledge that ends up doing what I said to begin with, that will have low taxes and limited government, rather than lower taxes and smaller government. I just don't think it's realistic. And I think if you're asking somebody to sign a pledge that they'll never do something, they're either going to have to lie to you, or we're going to have a Thelma and Louise ending. Remember Thelma and Louise? All right? All right, we had Harry and Louise in the early 90s about healthcare reform. This time we need to avoid Thelma and Louise. Envision 3 generations of Americans in a convertible Cadillac headed for a fiscal cliff. And that's what we're headed for. Now, let me reinforce what I'm saying. I believe in low taxes and limited government. I believe staunchly in that. And I believe government is overpromised, underdelivered, it's way out of shape, and we need to dramatically reform it. In fact, I got a book coming out next March, and we'll talk a lot about that. But the fact of the matter is, I'm also a realist. I can read numbers. Numbers don't lie. Thank you.